Of course, he's old. But his wallet never knows what saving means, I whispered to myself, adjusting my diamond earrings in the mirror. Harold was 66, and honestly, that didn't bother me one bit. A man with a Maserati and a Rolex deserves attention, no matter how many wrinkles frame his confident smile. Life is about being practical, isn't it? We met by accident. Well, not really. I knew exactly where to find men like him: art galleries, exclusive parties, the kind of places where luxury isn't just shown off, it's flaunted. And Harold? He noticed me the moment I walked in. Do you actually understand this art? He asked, his voice smooth and calculated, or do you just enjoy looking like part of the scene? I smirked, taking a step closer. Aren't they the same thing? I said, tilting my head just enough to catch his attention. His gaze lingered, not on the paintings but on me. In a room full of overpriced canvases, I was suddenly the centerpiece. Within minutes, we were talking like old acquaintances. He spoke about art with an air of authority, tossing in stories about his travels and business ventures. I laughed at the right moments, nodding when it seemed appropriate. And then he said the words I had been waiting for. Have dinner with me tomorrow. I want to show you what real life looks like. Real life? I knew exactly what he meant. Dinners in 5-star restaurants, trips to Paris for the weekend, and, of course, gifts, expensive, dazzling gifts that made your head spin. The next evening, I found myself standing in front of one of the fanciest restaurants in the city. Harold was waiting at the entrance, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Right on time, he said, flashing a smile that was equal parts charming and calculated. He opened the door for me, and I stepped into a world I had always dreamed of but never quite touched. Inside, everything was perfect. Crystal chandeliers hung low, casting a golden glow on tables draped in white linen. The air smelled of truffle oil and wealth. Harold guided me to a secluded corner, where a waiter appeared almost instantly with a bottle of wine. I took the liberty of ordering for us, Harold said, his tone casual but firm. Of course, I replied, my voice light and agreeable. I wasn't here to argue. We talked about everything, well, mostly about him. Harold had a way of steering the conversation back to his accomplishments, his stories, his world. And I let him. Every word he spoke painted a picture of a life so far removed from mine that it felt like stepping into a movie. Tell me, Lily, he said suddenly, his voice dropping to a quieter, more intimate tone, what is it you really want out of life? I paused, letting the question hang in the air. The truth? I wanted everything he had of money, power, freedom from the mundane. But I couldn't say that, could I? I want to live beautifully, I said finally, meeting his gaze. To wake up every day and know that life is more than just surviving. Harold leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. A good answer, he said. And do you think you're ready for that kind of life? Show me, I replied, keeping my voice steady, almost challenging. His smile widened. He liked boldness, and I knew it. The dinner passed in a blur of laughter and carefully chosen words. Harold was magnetic, effortlessly commanding attention, and I made sure to reflect his energy. I laughed at his jokes, asked just enough questions to keep him talking, and matched his confidence with a quiet charm that I knew would hook him. When the waiter brought the check, Harold didn't even glance at it. He simply handed over a black card with the ease of someone who had never had to worry about money. As we left the restaurant, Harold turned to me, his expression softer than it had been all evening. You're different, Lily, he said. I don't meet many people who can keep up with me. Maybe you've just been looking in the wrong places, I replied, letting my words hang in the air like a challenge. He laughed, low and rich, and for the first time, I felt like I had him exactly where I wanted. Over the next week, Harold texted me daily. His messages were short but thoughtful, little reminders that he was thinking of me. Good morning, beautiful. Hope your day's as amazing as you are. It was exactly the kind of attention I thrived on. And then, one afternoon, a delivery arrived at my apartment. Inside the velvet box was a diamond bracelet, so stunning it took my breath away. The note attached read, just a small token to brighten your day. I slipped it onto my wrist, the weight of it both exhilarating and grounding. Harold was investing in me, and I wasn't about to waste the opportunity. When we met again, Harold had stepped up his game. He picked me up in his Maserati, the engine purring like a predator ready to strike. I thought we'd do something different tonight, he said as I slid into the passenger seat. Different how? I asked, feigning curiosity. You'll see, he replied, his tone teasing but firm. He drove us to a private gallery, where the doors opened just for us. The space was empty except for the art and us. Harold led me through the exhibits, pausing in front of a particularly vibrant piece. This one reminds me of you, he said, his voice soft. Bold and unpredictable? I asked, smiling. Exactly, he replied, his eyes lingering on mine. For a moment, the room felt too quiet, too intimate. Harold stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. Lily, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, you make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And for the first time, I realized just how far he was willing to go for me. The restaurant was the kind of place where the lights were low, the prices were high, and every detail screamed exclusivity. Harold seemed perfectly at home, like he'd eaten here 100 times. Maybe he had. As soon as we sat, he gestured to the waiter, and a bottle of wine appeared almost instantly. I always choose the best, he said, pouring it himself. He made a show of swirling the glass, inhaling the aroma, and taking the first sip. You'll love this. It's perfect for the evening. Of course it is, I replied, letting my voice drip with admiration. He wanted to impress me, and I wasn't about to deny him that satisfaction. The wine was exquisite, but I made sure my reaction was just subtle enough to keep him guessing. He was studying me, the way a collector evaluates a rare artifact, searching for flaws, but hoping not to find any. So, Lily, he began, his voice as smooth as the wine, what is it you truly want out of life? It was a simple question, but the way he asked it carried weight. I could feel him testing me, waiting for an answer that would prove I deserved to be in his world. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel deliberate. I want to live beautifully, I said finally, meeting his gaze. No stress, no worries about tomorrow. Just the freedom to enjoy every moment. His eyes lit up, the faintest flicker of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Freedom, he repeated, almost to himself. That's an interesting way to put it. Isn't that what you have? I asked, tilting my head slightly, just enough to seem curious rather than accusatory. I've worked hard for my freedom, he said, leaning back in his chair. But freedom isn't given. It's taken. And it comes with risks. Risks like what? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Leaving your comfort zone, Harold replied, his voice dropping slightly. Real life begins when you're willing to step outside of what's safe. Are you ready for that? I held his gaze, a small smile playing on my lips. Show me, I said, my voice steady. The dinner progressed like a carefully choreographed dance. Harold led the conversation, but I made sure to steer it just enough to keep him engaged. He spoke about his successes, business ventures, properties, investments, but he never revealed too much. He wanted to remain an enigma, and I let him. When the food arrived, he watched me closely as I took my first bite. What do you think? He asked, his tone expectant. It's incredible, I said, and I meant it. The flavors were rich, complex, and utterly foreign to someone like me, who usually ate takeout. Good, he said, nodding. I like to share the finer things with people who can appreciate them. Is that what this is? I asked, setting my fork down. You showing me the finer things? It's more than that, Harold replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. I'm showing you what life could be. But only if you're willing to embrace it. And what does that involve? I asked, leaning forward slightly, just enough to show I was interested but not desperate. It involves trust, he said simply. And risk. By the time dessert arrived, the dynamic between us had shifted. Harold was no longer just trying to impress me, he was investing in me. His words carried a subtle intensity, as though he was trying to convince both of us that this wasn't just another dinner. I can see something in you, Lily, he said, his voice quieter now. You're different. You're not like the others. The others. Of course, there had been others. Women who had sat across from him at the same table, drinking his wine and listening to his stories. But I wasn't them, and he needed to believe that. Maybe you're just finally looking in the right place, I replied, letting the words hang in the air. Harold chuckled, shaking his head slightly. Maybe, he said. As the waiter cleared our plates, Harold leaned back in his chair, studying me. You intrigue me, Lily, he said. But intrigue alone isn't enough. If you want to be part of my world, you have to prove you're ready for it. And how do I do that? I asked, keeping my tone light but curious. Trust me, he said, his voice steady. And don't look back. By the time we left the restaurant, the city was quiet, the streets illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. Harold's car was waiting for us, a sleek, black Maserati that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. He opened the door for me, and as I slid into the passenger seat, I felt the weight of his expectations settle over me. You know, he said as he started the engine, most people spend their whole lives waiting for an opportunity to change everything. They're too afraid to take it when it comes. And you think I'm not like them? I asked, glancing at him. I know you're not, Harold said, his tone firm. You wouldn't be here if you were. As the car glided through the empty streets, I couldn't help but think about the night's events. Harold was testing me, but in a way, I was testing him too. He wanted to believe that he was in control, that he was leading this game. And for now, I was happy to let him think that. But deep down, I knew the truth. Harold wasn't just showing me his world, he was inviting me to take it. The weeks that followed felt like living in a fantasy. Harold spared no expense, and I made sure to play my role perfectly. Every gift he gave, every surprise he orchestrated, was met with wide eyes and breathless gratitude. One evening, he handed me a velvet box over dinner. Inside was a diamond bracelet, glittering under the dim light of the restaurant. Just a small token, he said with a casual shrug. I gasped, letting my fingers trace the delicate stones. Harold, it's incredible, I said, my voice dripping with awe. Inside, I was calculating, if this was a small token, what would the big ones look like? It's nothing compared to what you deserve, he said, his tone warm, almost vulnerable. The vulnerability was new. It wasn't there in the beginning when Harold's confidence felt unshakable. But now, as he watched me slip the bracelet onto my wrist, I could see it, he was falling. Every meeting seemed to top the last. When he invited me to Paris, I wasn't surprised, but I made sure to act like I was. Paris? I said, my voice rising with faint excitement. I want to show you the places that inspire me, Harold said, taking my hand across the table. His touch lingered, and his eyes held mine a moment too long. And I want you to feel what it's like to live beautifully. His words were almost poetic, and I played along. You always know how to make me feel special, I said softly, squeezing his hand just enough to make him believe it. The trip was everything I expected, a suite at a 5-star hotel, private tours of museums, and dinners in Michelin-starred restaurants. Harold loved watching me soak it all in, his smile growing every time I marveled at the view or praised his choices. This city suits you, he said one night, as we sipped champagne on a terrace overlooking the Seine. Maybe I belong here, I replied, letting my voice carry a hint of longing. You belong anywhere you want to be, he said, his tone serious. And I'll make sure you get there. It was a promise, and Harold wasn't the type to break promises. Back home, his gestures grew even grander. One evening, he handed me a set of keys, a brand new car. I wanted you to have something that fits your style, he said. Harold, I said, covering my mouth in mock shock, you didn't have to. But I wanted to, he interrupted, his smile softening. Seeing you happy makes me happy. The line felt rehearsed, but the look in his eyes was genuine. Harold wasn't just giving me gifts, he was giving me pieces of himself. And the more he gave, the more I could see how deeply he was falling. It wasn't just the gifts. Harold started opening up in ways I hadn't expected. He told me about his late wife, about the loneliness that had consumed him after her passing. I thought I'd never feel alive again, he admitted one evening. But then you came along. Harold, I said, my voice soft and soothing, you don't have to be alone anymore. His eyes glistened, and he reached for my hand. You've brought something back into my life that I thought was gone forever, he said. It was a touching moment, one that might have moved someone else. But all I could think about was how much further I could push him. With every passing day, Harold's affection grew, and so did his need to remind me of it. You've changed me, Lily, he said during one of our many dinners. I haven't felt this way in years. You've changed me too, I lied, my smile sweet and sincere. It was almost too easy. Harold believed in me more than anyone ever had. He saw me as his muse, his chance to rewrite the story of his life. And I let him, because every word he spoke, every gesture he made, brought me closer to the life I wanted. But even as Harold fell deeper, I felt nothing. Not guilt, not regret, just satisfaction. He was mine, completely and willingly. One evening, as we walked through the city after dinner, Harold stopped suddenly. "Lily," he said, turning to face me, "I need you to know something." His tone was serious, his expression vulnerable. My heart raced, not from emotion, but from the anticipation of what he might say next. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, letting the words sink in. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I knew would come. "Harold," I said, reaching for his hand, "you mean so much to me." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. He did mean something to me, just not in the way he hoped. As Harold pulled me into an embrace, I felt the weight of his emotions pressing against me. He was giving me everything, his heart, his trust, his entire world. And I was taking it, piece by piece. But deep down, I knew this couldn't last forever. Harold might be blinded by love now, but eventually, he'd see the truth. And when that day came, I would already have everything I wanted. Harold's house was a palace, plain and simple. Marble floors stretched endlessly, catching the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Paintings I couldn't name hung on every wall, framed in gold that likely cost more than my rent for a year. He guided me through the hallways with an arm around my waist, his touch steady and firm, like he was afraid I might slip away. "This is all yours?" I asked, widening my eyes just enough to look impressed. He smiled, the kind of smile that was both proud and humble. "All this," he said, gesturing to the grandeur around us, "and much more." I tilted my head and leaned into him, letting the warmth of his presence wrap around me. "It's incredible," I said softly. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like this." "That's because there's no one like you to see it with," he replied, his voice low and deliberate. We stopped in front of a massive glass window overlooking an expansive garden. The view was breathtaking, but I kept my focus on Harold. His eyes were fixed on me, softer than I'd ever seen them. "You've changed my life, Lily," he said, his hand moving to rest on mine. "I thought I had everything. But you've made me realize what I was missing." The words hung heavy in the air, and I forced myself to hold his gaze. His vulnerability was almost endearing, but it was also a reminder of how tightly he was wrapped around my finger. "I feel the same way," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Being with you has shown me what's possible. What life could really be like." Harold's expression softened further, his grip on my hand tightening slightly. "You mean that?" he asked, his tone almost unsure. I nodded, letting my smile grow just enough to seem genuine. "Of course I do. You're unlike anyone I've ever met, Harold." As the evening went on, Harold seemed lighter, more open. He showed me room after room, each one more opulent than the last, but I knew this wasn't just about the house. He was showing me his life, his world, and inviting me into it. When we returned to the sitting room, he poured us each a glass of wine. The fire crackled in the background, casting warm shadows across the room. Harold sat beside me, closer than he usually did. "Lily," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "I need to ask you something." My heart raced, not out of fear or excitement, but anticipation. Whatever he was about to say, I knew it would bring me closer to everything I wanted. "You've become so important to me," he continued, his eyes locked onto mine. "I've never felt this way before, not since my wife." There it was again, his vulnerability. I placed my hand on his arm, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Harold, you don't have to compare this to the past," I said softly. "What we have is ours. It's new. It's different." He exhaled, a faint smile appearing on his face. "You're right," he said. "And that's what makes it so special." As the night went on, I felt his guard lowering even further. Harold wasn't just infatuated anymore, he was invested. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way he hung on every word I said. But even as he poured out his heart, I couldn't help but wonder, how did he not see through me? How did he not notice the way I carefully curated every reaction, every smile? Was he really so blinded by love? Or did he just want to believe in the fantasy we'd created together? "Lily," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to appear calm. "What is it?" I asked, my voice steady. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping to the floor before returning to mine. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The room seemed to grow quieter, the crackle of the fire fading into the background. I held his gaze, letting the weight of his words sink in. This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for. "Harold," I said, my voice soft and full of emotion, "I don't know what to say. That means so much to me." His smile widened, and he reached for my hand again, his grip firm but gentle. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just promise me you'll stay." As the firelight flickered, casting shadows across the room, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. Harold was giving me everything, his trust, his love, his entire world. And I was taking it, one piece at a time. But even as I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his presence, I couldn't shake the thought, how long could this last? How long before he realized the truth? And when that day came, what would I do? His house, with all its opulence, no longer felt foreign. The soft rugs underfoot, the subtle scent of expensive cologne, the warmth of the fireplace, it all felt familiar, like I'd always belonged here. I could already see myself living in this world, where money wasn't a problem but a solution. Harold stood close, too close. His eyes bore into mine, not just seeing me, but searching for something deeper. There was longing in his gaze, an unmistakable vulnerability. And something else, a belief that I was different, that I wasn't like the others who had passed through his life. "You don't even realize how much you've changed me," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. His hand brushed against mine, tentative but deliberate. The simplicity of the gesture carried weight, as though it meant more than either of us was willing to admit. I smiled, perfecting my role. "Maybe you underestimate how much you've changed me," I replied, my voice soft, tinged with something he'd interpret as sincerity. His fingers glided over my wrist, moving slowly, cautiously, as if he were afraid to break the moment. "Lily," he murmured, his tone deepening, "you're the only one who makes me feel alive again." I could feel the weight of his words, the intensity behind them. This wasn't just admiration anymore. Harold was giving me everything, his heart, his trust, and the key to his world. And I was already tasting it, feeling the weight of his money and the life it could give me. The new car parked outside my apartment, the upcoming trip to Paris, it was all his, but it felt like mine. "Are you sure you want this?" he asked, his voice quieter now. His hand moved to my shoulder, his touch gentle yet firm. His eyes searched mine, filled with hope, almost pleading. I stepped closer, closing the small distance between us. The warmth radiating from him felt overwhelming, almost suffocating, but I didn't pull back. Instead, I raised my hand, letting it brush against the collar of his shirt. His breath caught, just for a moment, and I felt the tension between us grow heavier. My fingers slid along the line of his wrist, light and deliberate, and I felt him shiver under my touch. Everything we had kept hidden until now was surfacing, unspoken but undeniable. This was no longer a game, not for him. His hand moved again, this time grazing my back, slow and careful, as though testing whether I would pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into the moment, letting it consume us both. The air between us felt electric, charged with everything we weren't saying but couldn't ignore. Harold exhaled deeply, his head dipping slightly as though the weight of his emotions was finally too much to bear. "Lily," he said, his voice almost trembling, "I've never felt this way about anyone." I didn't respond with words. I let the silence speak for me, my touch lingering, my movements deliberate. His hand slid further, hesitant but insistent, and I felt the intensity in every small gesture, every brush of his fingertips. The fire crackled softly in the background, its warmth mirrored in the heat radiating between us. Harold's breathing grew heavier, matching the pounding of my own heartbeat. Every second stretched, every touch deepened the moment. And then it happened. I won't describe every detail. It's enough to say the line between us disappeared. The walls that had held us back crumbled in an instant, and everything that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, raw, and overwhelming. Harold gave himself to me completely, without reservation, without hesitation. He trusted me in that moment more than anyone ever had. Afterward, the room felt quieter, the air heavier. Harold sat beside me, his hands still resting on mine, his gaze fixed on the fire. He looked at peace, content in a way I hadn't seen before. "This is everything I've ever wanted," he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "You are everything I've ever wanted." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I looked at him, at the man who had just crossed every line for me. I felt the weight of his emotions, the depth of his belief in us, or rather, in me. It feels right, I said finally, letting my words hang in the air. But inside, I couldn't help but wonder how long this illusion could last. Harold believed in the fantasy we'd created, but how much longer could I keep it alive? This is where it happened. But tell me, was I wrong to let it go this far? Or did Harold make his own choice? What would you have done? Let me know in the comments.